small vertebrates, that kind of thing, anything with a backbone. There are invertebrate paleontologists, which are, if you're familiar with two different kinds of paleontology, you're familiar with those guys. They study shells and anything that, lots of things that make lots of fossils. Sometimes there are folks that will study footprints and that kind of thing. The third group are micropaleontologists. Micropaleontologists are kind of a weird breed in that it's basically any kind of paleontology that you need a microscope in order to study. So someone that studies a microvertebrate assemblage, so tiny little bones and tiny teeth that are found in a cave, is considered a micropaleontologist. There's also people that study pollen. Most of the people don't like being called micropaleontologists because they'd rather be called palynologists, which is the fancy word for people that study pollen, but it's still paleontology that's done really, really tiny. Paleontologists study the ocean and the marine realm. So our field actually started in the early 1800s with the Challenger expedition, where an English group of scientists went out on a very large ship and started dredging the ocean. And when they pulled up sediment, mud from the bottom of the ocean, they were very confused because there were all sorts of these really weird kind of shapes in them. And so our field, a lot of the early history is from that expedition and then on farther as we've understood more and more about what these things can tell us. So there are basically, I thought about holding them, there are four basic types of microfossils when we consider the marine realm. There are the planktic forams, which I study, and then there are these things called diatoms. So diatoms are usually they're flat. This was the only file I could find on the internet. They're usually flat, and they kind of come in this like a old kind of hat box where there's a round or sometimes sort of squished shape like this, and there is a small sort of ring around the side, and then there's a small, slightly larger bit that goes over the top. These are called frustrals, but really you can think of them more or less as shells. They make these shells or frustrals out of silica, and they're an important part of a lot of the Southern Ocean around Antarctica is chock full of these things. I'm going to start this way because I want to be fair. So those things are generally the size of a grain of silt, or up to, when they're really, really big, the size of a small, very small grain of sand. So there's also another group that makes their shells or tests, in this case, out of silica, but they're a little bit bigger. So these things are around the size of a grain of sand, a little bit on the bigger side. So these are two things called radiolarians. So diatoms are doing photosynthesis. They are producing, they're photosynthesizing just like plants. These things are called zooplankton, and they're actually eating diatoms and other kinds of things. Sometimes they do a little photosymbiont, which means there are things that live inside of them that will do photosynthesis, but usually they're eating these. Unfortunately, on my printer, on the 3D printer we just bought, there is a radiolarian about that big, which was not quite done when I had to leave. They make these kind of skeletons, so we can find these things in ocean sediments as well. So diatoms are producing lots of oxygen, and radiolarians are consuming things. One of the things that radiolarians, when we find them, tell us is that we're looking at a high productivity environment. When there's lots of food and the organisms that are living in the ocean are happy and doing lots of consumption and eating things, we see much more radiolarians. So around, say, the equatorial region where there's lots of upwelling, we have lots of new nutrients coming up, we see a whole lot of radiolarians. Okay, so I also have these things, which are exactly the same thing. This is a nanofossil called Huxleyi. So these things are they make their shells out of calcium carbonate. So this is the same stuff as chalk. In fact, actually, if you are familiar with the White Cliffs of Dover, it's a lot of, well, not exactly this species, but this same group. There's all sorts of these tiny little shells. When you take a look at this, there's these little circles on it. Each of those are called a lith. These things are incredibly tiny. They're basically between the size of a grain of silt and clay. They are very, very small. The foram, for example, one of those tiny little like golf ball holes, one of these things would actually fit on the side of one of those holes, and it'd be hard to see because it's so small relative to the size of that thing. So, sorry, I was told I had to be mic'd. So nanofossils are, yeah, I'll try not to trip. So one of the things that is particularly cool about nanofossils is they're a weird kind of example of an organism that you have to use a microscope in order to see. You cannot see it with the naked eye. You can see it from space. So Huxleyi, the one that I'm passing around, actually will sometimes bloom in these huge quantities, and they will have, if you look at a photo of the coast of England, sometimes there's this kind of like whitish smear off the coast. Those are Huxleyi sometimes. So these are things where it's this sense of scale is kind of hard to communicate, basically. Again, I teach an introductory course, and one of the things I like to do is try to make my students think about like, oh, there are things that I can't see, and sometimes they're really big, and sometimes they're really small, and sometimes they're both. Okay, so the last group are the planktic foraminifera, which is what I study, which is why I printed off like 6 different forams. We'll sometimes refer to these things as forams, or my supervisor for my PhD referred to them as bugs, even though they're a single-celled creature that has nothing to do with insects. Actually, we'll get to why in a bit. So they come in a variety of different forms. There's 2 main types. There are things that are called benthic foraminifera that live on the bottom of the ocean. So that's what this one is. Okay. On the end, and looks like an artist. So that one lives at the bottom of the ocean and will consume detritus, and some of them will live on the sediment, some of them will live inside the sediment. The rest of them, because I specialize in the planktic, the floating ones, I have 5. So these guys will live at a variety of different depths in the ocean. Some live in the mixed layer within like the top 100 or so meters. Some will get way farther down into the thermocline where the temperature starts changing. So they live way, way, way deeper. The different kind of shapes tell us what species they are. And some of them will live higher up, some will live lower. I'm going to pass around all but this one because I'm going to use it later. I'm skipping you guys, I'm sorry. Okay, with these groups, many of them, so the forams in particular, showed up in the Cambrian about 500 million years ago, but we only really had benthic foraminifera, the ones that live on the bottom of the ocean. It wasn't until basically the Jurassic where most of these groups actually showed up in Earth history. This time in Earth history is actually called the Mesozoic Marine Revolution. If you talk to an invertebrate or a vertebrate paleontologist, they will tell you that the really important thing is that things developed stronger teeth, and there were bigger shells, and they could attack things more easily, and there's all sorts of changes that happen in the ecosystem. You ask a micropaleontologist, we'll say, no, the important thing is that there's a lot of sediment that's produced in the ocean and it's moved offshore. Which is, again, why we don't really get shown up. We don't get invited to parties. So this is actually a tremendously important thing that happens in Earth history. So early on in Earth history, the climate is actually relatively volatile. Things happen really rapidly. There are big changes. Climate will get hot, it'll get cold, it'll get hot, it'll get cold. Carbonate is an important sediment in the ocean system. It is part of the reason that climate change hasn't been a bigger problem than it actually is. It acts as a buffer. So carbonate is kind of like Tums. Sorry, I'm American. Tums exists in Canada, right?
Yes.
Awesome, okay. Great. So carbonate is chalk, which will turn into limestone when it's lithified, but it's this an agent that will help to buffer changes in ocean chemistry. And so when we add more CO2, this pushes the chemistry of the ocean, and part of the way that we're absorbing CO2 in the ocean is by changing changing the carbonate, using it, consuming it. However, you have to have the carbonate to actually be able to do that cycle, and so climate's much more volatile before we have this. So the foraminifera, the coccolithorids, are really important in moving this carbonate offshore and allowing that process to happen, allowing that buffering system to exist. Okay. So not the last thing. Foraminifera are a tremendously important organism for a couple of different reasons, and we're going to go through a few of them, basically. The first one is we can use them for what we call biostratigraphy. So biostratigraphy is the idea that we can look at a fossil, and we can identify the fossil to its species, and that tells us how old the sediment that we're looking at is. So, for example, the reason I kept this one is this guy is called Truncanculinoides, and it is a marker for the Pliocene and Pleistocene boundary. So this thing, it's one that's shaped like a pyramid, and it evolves from a ancestor that's actually doesn't have this really sharp boundary, which I realize you probably can't see. When it comes to you, there's a really sharp boundary, and you can see if you flip it over onto the smoother side, there's actually this little lip that goes all the way around. The ancestor of it doesn't have that. So when this thing develops this lip, we actually know that we've moved from one interval of time into another. And so it acts as a marker for a change in time. Most of paleontology, so everyone's familiar with the geologic time scale, right? There's the Mesozoic, there's the Jurassic. As someone who became a paleontologist because of the movie Jurassic Park, many people are familiar with that one. The original reason that we had that system is because we've done a lot of this. We've looked at when there are big changes in organisms, and those are when we put these markers, where we make these changes in time. And so this is an example of us using this technique called biostratigraphy in order to establish this relative order in time. Okay, now I'm going to put this somewhere. So part of the reason that planktic foraminifera are used for this is because of a program called the Integrated Ocean Discovery Program. So the Integrated Ocean Discovery Program started out as the Deep Sea Drilling Project. It then has had a number of different names, but it's the largest earth science collaboration in the world ever, and it's been going for about the past 55 million years. So the Integrated Ocean Drilling Program is a scientific collaboration between 30 or so different nations across the world, including China, the United States. Canada buys in through the European Consortium in order to be able to sail scientists. So what we do is we go onto a couple of different boats. One of them was called the Joyous Resolution. There's also the Japanese operated ship called the Chikyu. And we basically go out and we take these really long tubes of sediment we call a core. This is a pen cup that I made out of a core tube. So on here, there's a little diagram of a ship, and that's the geodesic resolution. Like I said, I needed a lot of props because everything that I do is really visual. So this is basically this tube. We put this straw almost all the way down to the bottom of the ocean, and then we put it to the bottom of the ocean about 9.5 meters. And then we have this levering system that cuts it off and then pulls it up. We've been doing this for about the past 55 million years, sorry, 55 years, not 55 million. And we've got kilometer after kilometer after kilometer of sediment. So sometimes it's hard rocks at the bottom of the ocean. Sometimes it's this individual sediment that's covering over the hard rocks at the very bottom. The reason we do this is a number of different reasons. So we go out on these legs, and the third leg was to demonstrate the seafloor spreading, which is the mechanism by which the continents move. So plate tectonics is this idea that the continents have moved throughout Earth history, right? They've shifted. It's the reason the continents fit really nicely together, and as the continents have spread apart, for a while, there was no good mechanism for how this worked. Reasons that it does is we have these mid-ocean ridges that go all the way through the center of different ocean basins, and they're pushing things apart. This is a hypothesis. No one had demonstrated this is actually something that is reshaping the continents. One of the fundamental ideas is that if you move off of these mid-ocean ridges, then things will get older and older as you go off, right? Because these things are spreading, right? It's a spreading center. However, you have to actually get the sediment in order to be able to establish that, in order to demonstrate it. And so on the third time that these folks went out, that was the goal, was to look at how old the sediment was at several different intervals as we moved off of a spreading center. And then one on the same on the opposite side to make sure it matched. Right, so you don't need to do both sides because it's a mirror. So in the 55 years since that was demonstrated, there have been a lot of different reasons to go out and look at sediments in the ocean or look at the hard rocks in the ocean. For example, I sailed on a cruise when I was a PhD student, and we were sailing in the Caribbean, looking off the coast of a couple of islands called Martinique and Montserrat. These islands have an extensive volcanic history to the point where at one point a volcano went off on one of the islands and killed everyone on the island except for two people, one guy who was in jail, yep, and then a hermit who lived outside of town. So very important that you understand the history of volcanism to establish when volcanoes might go off again. The history of volcanism on the island was actually only about years, 1.5. And so the idea was to go offshore to look at a longer, more continuous sequence of events to try and establish a longer history of volcanism on that island. The other reason I went is because I do this kind of work, but I get really seasick. And so it was the Caribbean, which means it's really flat, especially at the time we went. And so it was something I could actually stomach. One of the things I mentioned is that there are some of the forams are actually just balls that are perfectly spherical. It's called Orbulina universa because it's just a sphere. And those, when you're on a ship, they will roll across your picking tray. Terrible for somebody to get seasick. I have actually a sample from one of those cruises. So if you look at this sample, which I am going to pass around, it's just full of tiny little white grains of sand. Those are almost all foraminifera. There might be a little tiny bit of volcanic ash inside. This black tray that I'm passing around is actually the tool of a micropaleontologist that isn't a microscope. So it's a gridded tray, and what we do is we will put we'll spread out a sample onto this tray, and then we'll use a little tiny paintbrush with a few bristles and just a little bit of water and pick up and move these individual grains of sand in order to manipulate them to look at them. As you've seen, right, with the models, they're different on each side and they also roll. And so being able to see all the different sides is actually very important in order to identify these things. So one of the other reasons that we look at these things is because the chemistry is actually really, really important. So calcium carbonate is calcium, carbon, and then oxygen. And so one of the things we can do is actually work isotopes of these things and get an idea of how climate has changed in the past. So an oxygen isotope will actually tell us about the temperature of the sea when these things were growing. And the carbon isotope will tell us about the carbon cycle as it happens when these things are growing. The other thing I mentioned is that they grow at different levels. And so if we look at the oxygen isotopes of a shallow mixed layer dwelling species, then we can get an idea of what the temperature was at the top of the ocean. And if we look at one of the deeper dwelling species, we can actually get an idea of what the temperature is in the sort of thermocline or lower, deeper in the ocean. And if we look at the benthic forams, we can actually get the temperature of the ocean bottom. So by understanding these things, we can actually understand past changes in climate. So one of the things after demonstrating plate tectonics, one of the big things that the scientific ocean drilling programs have done is to look at past changes in climate. And so some of our best records of past changes in climate have come from studying the chemistry of foraminifera. This includes things like looking at the Paleocene Eocene thermal maximum. So about 55 million years ago, there was this rapid change in climate that happened. Well, okay, it's a little bit scientifically contentious, but what it seems like it was a interaction between some important volcanism around Iceland and then methane release. Either way, there's a big injection of carbon into the atmosphere. It warmed the planet. There are all sorts of feedback mechanisms that made planetary warming even worse. And this caused a very large change in ecosystems and change in the way that the climate basically works. Remember how I talked about the carbonate and how it buffers the ocean chemistry? So carbonate is white. Background sediment in the ocean, in the deep ocean, is sort of reddish or brown. And what happens in PETM is that we have this white sediment from the earlier part of the record. There's a very, very sharp boundary where it turns very, very red or brown, and then it slowly grades back, because what's happened is that all of that carbonate has been scavenged away because of this big change in climate. I always hate saying this at this point because it's really a downer, but what we're doing at the moment is 10, 15 times, many times faster than the PETM, which is many times slower. So this gives us a perspective. Sorry. Okay, apropos to that discussion, one of the reasons that micropaleontology is a thing and has been a science and well funded in academia is because of the oil companies. So oil is actually the other thing that a micropaleontologist can do, if not studying climate change, is going out and trying to help find oil. It's very much a like black hat, white hat kind of thing. In order to find where we have oil, we need to understand the rocks that are buried deep within different locations, right? Because oil is trapped in different reservoirs, and we need to understand the geometry, what environments the rocks are containing, and understanding the paleontology, what organisms we can find if we look at those rocks, helps us understand where there might be, where there is more oil. One of the things that happened about the 1970s is that seismic stratigraphy, which is basically using sound waves to image underneath the seafloor or underneath rocks, was invented and became vogue, and that basically ate micropaleontology's lunch. And all the oil companies fired all the micropaleontologists, not all of them, most of them, and then hired them back as consultants. Think if I'm missing anything there. So one of the reasons that we sometimes call microfossils bugs is that when drillers would find all these sediments and would try to pass the sediment they wanted to have be analyzed by a micropaleontologist, they would refer to them as bugs and hand them to the micropaleontologist, who's the bug picker. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the quality of the foraminifera research fossil record. So I mentioned really early on that when I was a kid, I watched Jurassic Park. I was 10, and it kind of reshaped my brain. And when I went to undergrad, the reason that I wanted to be a scientist was because I wanted to work on dinosaurs. I thought that was incredibly cool, and it never left me as a child. I'm actually wearing a dinosaur t-shirt. It really hasn't left me. It's a Styracosaurus, which is like a triceratops with really much fancier kind of frill. I started to realize that the fossil record for dinosaurs is actually not good. So dinosaurs, right? When we find a new set of dinosaurs, it makes the news, usually. Right? They're expensive to find, they are big, they're very charismatic. But also, like finding a couple bones of one organism doesn't really tell you everything about that organism, right? If you find just this part of a dinosaur's leg, it tells you about the leg. You can make some extrapolations, but you can't really understand the entire organism by making a series of assumptions. It's also true that dinosaurs are not aquatic, and so usually they were living in land or maybe lake, near lakes. Lakes are really good, but those are not really great places to make rocks. Rocks are usually formed in really deep lakes or out in the ocean where we have much more continuous sedimentation, where we have much more continual supply. And there's this really deep area where we can have material be deposited. So dinosaurs are frequently taken apart, disaggregated, spread out throughout an environment because they're being consumed. We've got kind of a wonky fossil record, and we've got how many T-Rex skeletons? Single, maybe double digits, but not very many. The sample that I'm passing around has thousands upon thousands of individual fossils, and really the limitation on what we can understand with that, how well we can describe that sample, is actually the amount of time you'd really like to spend looking at it, because there's just so much in there. And so actually, if we think about the statistics of how to understand an environment, right, how many different individuals we need to count in order to figure out what is in this individual environment, we can do a much better job with that sample than we can by trying to understand dinosaurs. The other nice thing about the ocean is that it's kind of boring and homogeneous. Right? The ocean is a huge part of our planet. It's incredibly important. And as someone who considers himself some part of an oceanographer, there are interesting things. Casey's giving me a look. It is interesting. There's variety, but as far as it comes to on land, it's really kind of not featureless, but boring. So if we understand the ocean, we understand the ocean bottom, we can get a much better idea of Okay, I'm trying to think. It's the end of term, and I'm not quite done grading. So my brain has been on fire for like the last couple of days. Okay, I think the last thing I want to do is just step through some interesting kind of intervals in Earth climate in the past like 100 million years or so, just to give some perspective on the kind of things that we've been able to look at and answer with these kind of fossils. So, for example, in the Mesozoic, a really warm kind of interval. It's so warm that when we look at the England, right, the White Cliffs of Dover are basically, if you move like the Bahamas all the way up to England, because it's so warm. That's why I was talking about Amelia Huxleyi earlier, because it's making all those big giant sequences of chalk. One of the things that's really interesting about North America is in that interval, we also have the seaway that connects the Arctic Ocean all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. One open question is exactly how the circulation works in that seaway, but it's this really cool kind of interval where we have a variety of different environments that don't really happen to exist anymore on the planet. It also, funnily enough, separated, the continent into two different sides, and you have interesting evolutionary patterns that happen with the dinosaurs, because I am still about 10 years old, and they separate and do interesting kind of evolutionary things on either side. As we move out of the Mesozoic, things start to cool down a bit, but then at the end of the Mesozoic, at what we call the KPG boundary, or the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, the Earth gets hit by this really large impact. This really large impact is in the Gulf of Mexico again, and it hits right on the Yucatan Peninsula. I had a friend who actually, so one of the things, going back to the IUDP or the scientific ocean drilling projects, I had a friend who was on the cruise that actually drilled right into the impact crater, which had not happened yet. One of the cool things about that is that it's so shallow that you can't actually get a boat to do that work, because we would get too worried about hitting a gas pocket or something and capsizing the boat. So we actually use what's called a jack-up rig, which is basically a little flat boat that you take out and then drop legs down to the bottom of the ocean, and they just took a drill and like hung it over the side and lived in shipping crates on this weird little boat. So at 66 million years ago, we get hit by this a huge amount of death on the planet. It is the only thing that's happened, geologically speaking, to the planet other than modern climate change. One of the things that is strange about geologists is that we have a skewed sense of time. So if you think about the sense of time that you have when you were a kid versus when you, as you age, at 42, I have a small sense of this, where time starts to move faster and years start going faster and faster. One of the things about geology is that we think in what we call deep time thinking, where we think about mountains growing and disappearing kind of at this rate. And it's this weird switch that happens to undergraduates around like their third or fourth year, and sometimes you can try to push it a little bit earlier. So geology has this really slow pace to things. Modern climate change is really, really fast, so geologists get really freaked out about it because it's happening, even though we can sort of tell it, feel it a little bit if you live in the same place for long enough. Geologists get really freaked out because we know how long things like this are supposed to happen, and it's happening really fast. The KPG, however, is orders of magnitude massively, massively faster. When this thing hits, it not only produces no mushroom cloud because it hits hard enough. Mushroom clouds happen because you have this impact and it creates a cloud, and then it hits these layers in the atmosphere, and that's where it flattens out. This thing happened so fast that it hit and then blew material out to the moon, like things exited because it hit so hard. my friend that was on the cruise likes to say that there were probably forams on the moon because they got hit so hard they blasted. Oops. I also used to make a joke about being a micropaleontologist and being 6'5". So it blasts things all over the like all around the world. So one of the things it does is it vaporizes this particular rock that it hits, which is all sorts of like evaporite deposits, which have these really funky chemistry. Aerosolizes this and terrible things in the atmosphere. Makes it really dark, and then it gets really hot. It hits hard enough that it liquefies the rocks, puts them into the air, and then they start raining out as little droplets, which we call microspherules. So they actually reform as they become solid in the air and then keep falling. So there's actually like rock rain around major parts of the globe. We find these things in our cores. It's one of the ways we know we're looking at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, because all of a sudden there's these little tiny rocks that are perfect spheres, which is really weird. It produces shocked quartz. It does all sorts of terrible things. There's a tsunami that is basically higher than the Empire State Building that moves in, several states. I'm American. But actually washes over several states worth of the continent because it hit, again, in the Gulf of Mexico. It also produces the largest earthquake we've probably ever felt as a planet, and it causes basically the sides of the Gulf of Mexico all shake and then collapse into the Gulf of Mexico. And so there's all sorts of these like slide deposits that are at the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. So, really bad time. Yeah, I'm understated. So what's really interesting about the microfossils is that right before they're these tremendously wonderful, flamboyant, I'm going to say big, but they're like the size of a grain of sand, but like a big grain of sand. And they're all these complex forms. There's lots of differences, and we can do a really easy job of identifying, oh, this is this species, this is this species. There's probably 70 or so species of the plankton foraminifera right before the end. And then right afterwards, everything is so tiny, you have to use special instruments to actually wash the sediment. They're smaller than sand by a little. Only 2 to 3 species, sometimes 4 if you ask the right people. And they're all really, really small and look almost exactly the same. And that's because they look the same. And so it takes a long time for the ecosystem to recover, about 10 million years for the Earth system to basically recover from this big mass extinction. It slowly warms up. We get into the Eocene where it's still pretty hot. We get to the time we call the mid-Eocene climate optimum. We have relatively warm temperatures. Usually this is considered a time when we've got basically swamps in Alaska. I keep using American points of reference, I'm sorry. So at that point, we actually start to cool off, and we start starting having some ice on the planet. So about 34 million years ago, a couple of different parts, the Antarctica starts to glaciate, and we actually start getting some ice, and things cool off. We have a change in the environment where it flips from being really what we call the hothouse condition down to being what we call it considered an icehouse condition, where it's much more similar to today. Say one of the worst projections we've got for modern climate change is we slip back into something like the Eocene, which no one in this room would experience, but is something we think maybe the planet might be heading for. We kind of bounce around for a while and have sort of slightly warmer, slightly cooler temperatures, and we start seeing some glaciers in Greenland eventually, about 10 or so million years ago. And then we finally slip into what we call the interglacial cycles, where we have these we have larger glaciers and we have smaller glaciers, where we have things like the glacial lakes that form that have a bunch to do with the geology around the area. And that basically takes us to today, where we've got, we're living in an interglacial and we're trying to push ourselves out of the interglacial into even warmer times. The reason I went through all these different sort of climate change events is that the basis of all of these different records that we've got, I'm drawing this figure in my head, I'm sorry, is because of forams, because of looking at the chemistry of these things and trying to understand how they work. They're an undersung hero of the climate crisis. That was a stretch. Yeah. I would be very happy to take any questions that anyone's got. Thank you.
Is there any sort of DNA trail at all? These are...
Yeah, so there are. So one of the weird things that's been happening is that there are plenty of people who've worked on the DNA of these individual forams. And so they're really hard to culture, but if you go out and you scuba dive, you can actually catch them in jars. One of the things they do is they have all these, like, they're kind of like amoebas, so they've got these rhizopodia that spread out, and so they've got this network that actually makes them bigger than they look, essentially. So if we look at the DNA, it turns out that all these different individual things we've been calling a species are actually much more genetically complicated, and so sometimes there's 4 genetic species in one what we would call a morphospecies. It's like one set of shapes. There's actually 4 different genetic species. There are other times where we've got one genetic species and 4 different shapes that it produces, which is another complication. This is stuff that's been coming out in the past like 10, 15 or so years. So on a longer time scale, DNA is not really that stable. So it kind of falls apart because the protein isn't as stable. We can look at things that are longer lasting. So sometimes we call so lipids or fats. We can use those that have been made by a specific kind of organism and to look at temperature as well, or how much material from land or the ocean there is at an individual location. So there are lots of people who do chemical work as well, or like organic biochemistry, organic biogeochemists. Yeah?
Was there anything about what's driving the shapes? You know, some of them are very well ordered and some of them look like blobs.
Yeah, okay. So,
well, for example, do any of them have an evolutionary advantage? I mean,
yeah, well, so yes. So, fun story, sort of yes, sort of no. There are some shapes that we know are attached to specific adaptations. So there are species that actually have these like spines that attach to the test. And the spines are still made of calcium carbonate. And it's basically this long, kind of like twice as long as the test shell itself. So those are used as architecture to help spread out these things, photosymbionts. So basically, it's letting it farm, basically. So it'll move things called nanoflagellates or other organisms out into these tissues, and then we'll pull them back in if it gets attacked or it's worried about being eaten or something. Those, very clear relationship between why they're making the shape and why they have an advantage. However, sometimes we will see, so this guy, this thing has this the really sharp edge here is called a keel. So that in the modern ocean, something with a keel lives pretty deep in the thermocline. However, there are also things that look like this-ish in the Cretaceous that have a keel. Those things don't live deep in the ocean. They live kind of like up near the mixed layers a little bit below, which doesn't make sense, which has been a big problem in the community for a very long time because we all look at it and go, but it's heavier, it should be lower. Why is it not lower? That's an active area of research, basically. It's one I really like to answer. The answer might be this concept called genetic drift, where they're kind of accruing mutations and changing pressure on them. So because they have this cytoplasm that is outside of this shell, and they actually can't go entirely back into it, they don't, like water, their interaction with water doesn't really connect directly to the shape. Right? So there's other stuff interacting with them already. And then they can also decide to put more material into the vacuoles that are a part of their cytoplasm, and so they can change their buoyancy, which means why would you add this thing if you can already change your buoyancy? And so there's a lot that we don't quite understand. It's weird because we've been using these things as tools for an extremely long time, because they're incredibly important for all the reasons I was mentioning. There are some fundamental things that we don't really quite understand. That is something I've worked on before. Yeah.
Is everything you're talking prehistoric, or do you have anything that's alive today that is a descendant of these things?
Yeah, so all of these groups are still alive today.
Oh, okay.
I just studied the old ones because there's so much data that you can extract now, and it's more fun to work on things that are a little bit harder for me, I guess. That's kind of, doesn't really make sense, but that is the way I framed it in my head. So they all are alive today, yeah.
And they're studied?
Yes, oh yeah. Yeah, so all the genetic work that's been done is really recent work. There are plenty of people who have been working on blooms of these things, trying to understand why they're blooming. We have, there are 2 professors in our department who work on the diatoms and culturing them and working on their chemistry and stuff. So yeah, it's definitely a very active part of research.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So related to climate, you're using these different organisms live at different periods of time at different temperature readings
Yes.
and different concentration of CO2 in the
Yes.
atmosphere or in the ocean, or both?
The CO2 in the ocean, it's basically been percolated through into the ocean, so it's usually not, it's dissolved and that stuff. But yes, they are living at different.
So I was watching the show on Nature, I guess, or one of the nature shows on Snowball Earth, and how we went into that and came out of that.
Yeah.
And we've gone through, what, 2 or 3 snowball Earths over the last 4 billion years?
Yeah, so, but those are all basically really tightly together, and they're before, like, shells even evolved. They're before the Cambrian, so they're about 500 million years ago.
Okay.
But yeah.
So what was the main driver in the last 3 ice ages to cool the Earth enough to have an ice age and then to warm it up afterwards? What was,
Okay.
how was it CO2 generated and absorbed?
All right, so, okay, so, back to being a comic. Okay, so in the past ice ages, right, we have these changes that are sort of cyclical, right? So there's actually not just 3 ice ages, there's an entire pattern that go back and back and back, and there's dozens of them, basically.
If you, just as a point, if you go to, what's the beach out off of James Island? This side of James Island?
Yeah.
Sugar, I just lost the name for it. But anyway, on the cliff side there, you can see the archaeologists have found 3 different ice ages there.
Cool.
On that, so it's something to follow up with.
Yeah, those are, as an import to the island, I know where I do my field trip for my classes, and that's about as much as I've explored the local geology, which is just, I have 2 kids. But I will look into that. So one of the things I did not talk about, and one of the major reasons that we have these big changes in climate in the past, is the changes in the Earth's orbit. So the Earth has what we call Milankovitch cycles, named after a guy named Mutin Milankovitch, who was, oh man, anyway, so, and we have these changes in the Earth's orbit where, that's not, okay. this is the Earth. So the Earth is at a tilt right now, right? And one of the things that happens is that we have this tilt that goes back and forth. Right? And we sort of wobble back and forth. The other thing is the Earth has an orbit, right? And it is elliptical. And sometimes it squishes, and sometimes it goes back a little bit more and a little bit more. Right? It has this sort of oscillation. We also have precession, which is where exactly we're pointed at different positions in our orbit. So these things have different periods, and they change the way that the sun's rays hit the planet, right? And so if, for example, this is the sun, and we tilt more this way, it's actually warmer right here, and if we tilt a little bit back farther, it's more distributed. And so these are one of the major ways that the Earth's climate changes on these sort of cyclical, outside of big events happening. It's this sort of pattern. The other thing, and the reason that I pushed my sleeves up, is that these things work together. If you can imagine, we've got sine waves, right, these big curves, right? So each of these patterns, this one, the eclipse, and where we're pointed, all have two different forms where they oscillate at two different rates, and then they work together, all three of them together. And it also depends on where you are on the planet. So basically what the climate system does is it takes those different parameters and filters it through together. I realize I probably lost everybody. These things are complicated. It's the kind of thing where I'm not complaining. Nice to have a visual. But basically, the way these have interacted together for about the past few million years to do the ice ages is to give us basically 100 kiloyear kind of cycles. It does change, but that's sort of the way it works. So they change this, but it also changes where growing patterns are and those sorts of things, which are important influences in CO2. So it's sort of this combination of CO2 seems to be this like threshold we can move around in, and these changes modulate there, and we sort of move back and forth. We have had plenty of climate events where we sit at these really like warm combination where the sine waves all match up and it's constructive and things go really, really warm or really, really cold. I did my PhD in one, which was 23 million years ago, which was a really cold snap event. And everything was cold all at the same time, and then we sort of got out of it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Maybe just one more question.
sure. One more?
One more. One more.
Okay.
Jen, I am not 64. So thanks very much, Andy. That was fantastic. I just wanted to, so I'm one of the co-organizers. My name is Jennifer Cobb. I'm a professor in biochemistry at UVic, and I'm one of the co-organizers with Casey and Mark, and of the 2023-26 year, and I just, after, this one, we're going to be starting a new year in 2026, and I just want to give a plug for the speaker in January, and that will be Brad Nelson. And so he is a researcher at the Dealey Cancer Research Center, and the title of his talk will be Engineering the Immune Response to Cancer, Local Efforts in a Global Context. And so his group and lab at the Dealey Center, they have been conducting clinical trials right here in Victoria, and I hope you'll all come out and listen to that as well. So thank you very much for joining Cafe Side tonight, and have a pleasant evening and happy holidays.